It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to talk about something few people truly understand. Not the grandeur of Rome, not its emperors or marble arches, but the lives of those who built it, broke under it, and were never allowed to leave. This is the story of Roman slavery, not as a statistic, but as a sentence. A system designed not just to extract labor, but to erase dignity, memory, even name. It's not an easy story, but it's a real one. So, if you find comfort in quiet honesty, in learning something no one taught you in school, stay a while. And if you find yourself listening from a night shift, an empty apartment, or a bus ride home, tell me where you are, if you'd like. I read every word. Now dim the lights, and let's drift back in time. What does it mean to own a person? The question isn't rhetorical. In ancient Rome, it was a question with paperwork, price tags, legal codes. Owning a human being was as mundane and paper as owning a pair of sandals or a kitchen ladle, but nothing about it was mundane in practice. Let's begin in a villa outside Pompeii. It's mid-morning. The sun is already too hot, pressing down like a hand. Inside, the master is reading letters from the city. Outside, his slaves are working. One is pruning vines. Another is sweeping dust that will return by noon. A third you don't see because she's inside, nursing his child, not hers. This master, if he were asked, might describe himself as kind. He doesn't whip unless he must. He lets his slaves eat figs. He doesn't sell children unless the debt is urgent. But kindness isn't freedom, and not as cruel isn't good. The lie of the good master is one Rome loved to tell, especially to itself. Slaves were called instrumentum, vocalitorci tools. In law, they were not people. They had no family, no legal marriage, no property. Anything they owned belonged to their owner. Even their own body was not theirs. It could be branded, mutilated, rented out, thrown away. But Roman thinkers had a clever way of making this seem reasonable. They said, slavery is natural. Aristotle claimed that some people were born to be ruled. The Romans, ever practical, just made that philosophy profitable. And so the villa outside Pompeii hums with a quiet lie. The master believes himself just. The neighbors admire his discipline. Even some of the slaves, especially those born into bondage, might call him fair. But fairness means nothing when you can be beaten for looking up. When your body remembers what your mind tries to forget, the sting of a whip, the cold of a cell, the forced smile in front of guests. In private letters, Roman elites sometimes complained about their slaves. Too lazy, too loud, too cunning. Rarely did they ask, why did they run? Or, why did they steal? The answer was too obvious, and too uncomfortable. To be owned is to live in permanent performance. To please, to obey, to anticipate. To swallow anger, hide sorrow, and wear whatever face makes the day pass safely. And the worst part, the master can call this loyalty. He can praise your obedience, thank you for your smile, never realizing it was born of terror. This is the core of slavery in Rome. Not just the labor, but the denial of interiority, the erasure of self. A tool doesn't feel. And if a slave feels, he's dangerous. So they pretend not to, and Rome calls it peace. Imagine your name being forgotten while you are still alive. Not because of old age or illness, or the gentle erosion of time, but because it is taken from you, deliberately, publicly, permanently. In the Roman world, this wasn't a metaphor. It was the first act of ownership. When a person was enslaved by war, piracy, debt, or misfortune, their name was often the first casualty. Instead, they were labeled with where they came from, or what they were good for. Thessalian girl, cooked from Carthage. Strong boy, teeth intact. This wasn't poetic, it was inventory. Now picture the auction. The forum is crowded, not just with citizens and officials, but with the ambient sound of livestock, bargaining, sandals, scraping stone. On a raised platform, naked bodies stand in rows. Some have placards hung from their necks, listing skills, defects, or origins. Some have already been examined, like cattle mouth opened, limbs prodded, scars questioned. Buyers circle, they ask questions. How many words of Latin? Any history of theft? Can she birth children? A young girl, maybe 13, flinches when a man touches her shoulder. He notes this. It might mean trouble, or potential, depends on what he's buying for. A boy looks at the crowd and tries not to cry. He was a soldier's son 2 months ago. Now he's lot number 27, and his mother is no longer beside him. There are no family discounts. Roman law didn't recognize the bonds between enslaved parents and children. If you were born into slavery, your mother was your fate, not your family. If you were sold separately, no appeal could be made. No law forbade it. No God intervened. Sometimes, new masters allowed children to stay with their mothers. Sometimes not. Sometimes they promised and then changed their minds. The slave had no say. Even begging had to be careful. Too desperate and you seemed disobedient. Too cold and you seemed ungrateful. On auction day, silence was safety. What did it feel like to stand there, knowing your next breath might be taken in a different city, in a different tongue, under a different name? To feel your past collapsing behind you, not with violence, but indifference. The Romans called their empires civilized. They had poets, philosophers, aqueducts. But even their most enlightened minds rarely questioned the sale of a child. Cicero, brilliant orator, once argued eloquently about the rights of Roman citizens. But he also owned dozens of enslaved people, including ones who copied his speeches. Seneca, who wrote movingly about stoic virtue, advised kindness to slaves because it made a master more virtuous, not because the slave was a person. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, upheld laws that preserved slavery. He wept at the death of a friend, but not, so far as we know, for the people auctioned in the shadow of his palace. This is not a story of monsters. It is a story of ordinary people who accepted monstrous things because everyone else did. And if everyone agrees you are not a person, how do you prove otherwise? Especially when you're not allowed to speak. There's a word for something that must never be forgotten, yet is never spoken aloud. A name etched into bone, too painful for memory, too dangerous for denial. For many Roman slaves, that word was fug, branded into the forehead with a hot iron. Those 3 letters were an abbreviation, fugitivus, fugitive, a runaway. It meant the person had once tried to escape and failed. The Romans did not tattoo these letters gently. Branding was punishment and proclamation, pain and policy. The heat seared through skin into the nerves, making sure the message was not just visible, but unforgettable. If you ever looked into the eyes of someone so marked, you would see a life forced into a single word. Not mother, not singer, not survivor, just fug. Branding was not reserved for runaways. Some slaves were marked from the beginning. Their masters wanted to ensure no one could claim them. Sometimes the brand was on the forehead, sometimes the wrist, sometimes hidden beneath clothing, depending on how often the slave was expected to be seen. Rome had its reasons. In a world where rebellion simmered beneath every surface, identification was a kind of leash. If a slave ran, the mark could bring them back, or bring down punishment on anyone who tried to help. Escape was not just discouraged, was deformed. And yet, many tried. They ran through forests, through cities, through sewers. They disguised themselves as freedmen, snuck onto ships, begged for shelter under false names. They knew the risks. Capture meant torture. Recapture meant mutilation. Sometimes death. But they ran anyway, because even a day of freedom was worth the price. And what kind of life must you be living if that trade makes sense? Masters sometimes posted flyers. Runaway, male, 20 years, Greek, curly hair, speaks Latin poorly, branded on right thigh, reward offered. These notices read like wanted posters, but the crime was hope. In truth, the branding was not just physical, it was cultural. Slavery in Rome wasn't just about work, it was about speech, movement, identity. Slaves could not marry, could not vote, could not testify in court without torture. Even their words were suspect unless pain had squeezed them out. They were bodies without credibility. When a Roman master feared a slave might know something about theft, or murder, or conspiracy, he would not ask. He would order. Torture first, then listen. The logic was cruelly circular. Slaves were liars by nature, unless in pain. Pain purified truth. So the lash became a language, and screams became sentences, and Rome called it justice. Branded, beaten, silenced Roman slaves lived in a world that demanded obedience, and then punished them for anything less than joy. It is hard to imagine that kind of daily performance. To be always watching your voice, your posture, your breath. To laugh at jokes you do not find funny. To say thank you to the man who owns your back. And somewhere deep inside you, a single thought flickers. I was not born for this. But you do not say it aloud, because your tongue, like your name, is not yours anymore. Rome was not ashamed of its wealth. It wore it like armor. Gold-threaded togas, imported perfumes, tables carved from single slabs of African citrus wood, nothing subtle, nothing spared. And for the Roman elite, luxury meant people, not just having them, displaying them. To own many slaves was not merely useful, it was aesthetic, a kind of social theater. Walk into a senator's home and you might be greeted by a doorman slave, clothed in finer linen than most free men. Beyond him, a young girl would offer you wine. Behind her, a silent child with a tray of olives. And behind all of them, in shadow, a eunuch watching for spills, breaches, or boredom. Each one of them belonged to the house, as much as the mosaic floor or the painted ceilings. The cruelty in these spaces was often quiet. Slaves in luxury homes were expected to be invisible except when needed, to appear with perfect timing, to anticipate moods, to disappear without offense. Their mistakes were not corrected, they were punished. Some wealthy Romans, like the infamous Vettius Pollio, kept special punishments as conversation pieces. Pollio once ordered a slave to be thrown into a tank of lampreys for breaking a glass. When the Emperor Augustus protested, Pollio shrugged. A man should be allowed to manage his property. Property, that word again. In smaller homes, cruelty could be more intimate. A single slave girl might be responsible for cleaning, cooking, childering, and serving meals, all under the gaze of a matron who resented her youth. In the kitchens, cooks risked lashes for meals that displeased. Wet nurses were beaten if infants cried too loudly. Hairdressers could be whipped for knots or tangles. Even laughter was regulated. A slave laughing in front of a master might be punished for disrespect, but a slave who looked too serious could be accused of plotting. It was a tightrope without a net. And still, from the outside, this all looked normal. Visitors didn't flinch. Children grew up thinking this was how the world worked. Philosophy students quoted Plato, then ordered their slaves to fetch lunch. Even poets, those tender observers of human pain, rarely spared a line for the people who brought them ink and wine. There is something particularly chilling about a society that aestheticizes suffering, where pain becomes decor, where a human life is part of the scenery. And yet this was not exceptional in Rome. It was expected. Even the slaves who worked as actors, musicians, or secretaries, those closest to respectability, lived with this edge. Their beauty, their skills, their charm, all weapons that could turn against them. A master who grew jealous could punish without trial. A mistress could sell a girl for being too admired. Praise was no protection. In fact, the more a slave stood out, the more dangerous their position became. This is not a tragedy that ended at the auction block. It was a theater that played every day in every Roman town, behind every banquet, inside every song, beneath every fine garment, and no one stopped the play, because the audience was enjoying the show. Every now and then, someone was freed. The Romans called it manumissio, literally, sending from the hand, a ceremonial gesture, often in front of witnesses, sometimes formalized by a rod touched to the head. With this act, a slave could become a libertasar freedman. It sounds like redemption, but like so many things in Rome, freedom was a complicated gift. Let's begin with the illusion. To the outside world, a freedman could walk the streets like any other. He could marry, own property, earn money. Some became richer, especially those who had once worked as administrators, agents, or entertainers. Some even rose high in imperial circles, whispering advice into the ears of emperors. But the shadow of slavery never left. A freedman owed lifelong loyalty to his former master, now his patronus. He was expected to vote in line with his patron's wishes, appear at his door each morning, assist in his affairs. In exchange, the patron offered protection and control. The bond was unequal. The former slave was free in name, but in practice, he lived in debt. Even his children inherited this obligation, and that was the best-case scenario. Most slaves were never freed. Some hoped, many didn't. Hope, after all, was dangerous. It made obedience harder. It made pain sharper. It made days longer. And the Romans knew this, which is why they held up the story of manumission like a carrot. Work hard, be loyal. Someday you might be like Felix, or Pallas, or Narcissus. But for every slave who was freed, there were hundreds who were not. The ones who died in the fields, unnamed and unmourned. The ones broken by mines. The ones who never even learned Latin because no one taught them, because no one needed them to speak. Freedom was less a destination than a myth, a story told to keep the wheels turning, a possibility dangled just far enough away to keep hands busy and heads down. And even those who were freed found that the world did not forget. A brand may fade, but a reputation does not. A freed woman might marry, raise children, run a shop, but still be called a slave behind her back. Her daughter might dress as a Roman matron, but never quite be welcomed. Her son might rise in business, but never in name. Rome was a society built on hierarchy, on visibility, on shame, and there was always someone below you. to keep you reaching upward. So yes, slaves could be freed, but they were rarely free. Even in death, the tombs of freedmen bore reminders. Once a slave, now a man, carved into stone, as if to explain, to justify, to plead. And perhaps that is the saddest freedom of all. The kind you must constantly prove, even after you've earned it, even after you're gone. There are places the Roman elite never saw, not because they didn't own them, but because they didn't need to. The money came in without the sight, without the smell, without the sound of backs breaking under open sky. These were the latifundy vast agricultural estates in the countryside, worked by slaves in chains. Imagine it, sunrise over an olive grove. The light is golden, but nothing here feels holy. The air is already thick with dust and insect wine. Rows of bodies move in silence, swinging scythes, hauling buckets, trimming branches, until their arms ache. No music, no jokes, no rest unless commanded. And if someone falters, if they stumble, faint, or slow the pace, there is a man watching. A villicus, the overseer, usually a slave himself, promoted for his brutality. He carries a staff. He shouts in Latin, Greek, sometimes Punic. The language doesn't matter. The threat is universal. No one asks how you slept. No one cares if your ankle is still swollen. No one will wait for you to recover. This is not farming. This is extraction. Roman agriculture, especially in the late Republic, was a machine powered by grain, olives, wine, products of prestige, profit, and political control, all harvested by those who would never taste the finest versions of what they touched. Slaves in the countryside died young. They were not investments, but consumables. Bought cheap, worked hard, replaced without ceremony. There are no names recorded for them, only numbers. In the writings of Columella, a Roman agricultural expert, we find instructions: how many slaves to keep per hectare, how many hours they should work, how many calories they need to function but not thrive. He advises iron collars for runaways, communal sleeping quarters without doors, constant surveillance. He warns against kindness. It breeds laziness. Cato the Elder was even more direct. He suggested selling old slaves who could no longer work like worn-out oxen. Keep the strong, discard the rest. In winter, these slaves built walls, cleared forests, dug ditches. In summer, they harvested under a sun that split skin and spirit. If they died, they were buried in mass graves behind the villa, if at all. Sometimes the bodies were burned without rites, their ashes scattered like refuse. No one sang hymns, no one cried, because grief, like hope, was a luxury reserved for citizens. And yet, even here, among the vines and stones and silence, there were small rebellions. A slower step, a broken tool, a whisper in a foreign tongue after dark, a hidden god carved into the underside of a stone. Some slaves practiced secret rituals from home Libyan chants, Thracian symbols, Egyptian prayers whispered into the wind. Their masters dismissed this as superstition, but for the enslaved, it was identity, resistance, memory. Even if they couldn't say their names anymore, they could remember what came before. They could remember what it meant to be more than this. The fields took everything: blood, bone, belief, but not always the soul. Not entirely, not yet. If the fields were cruel, the mines were death. Roman mines were not just sites of labor, they were holes in the earth where sunlight died, where lungs collapsed, and where names went to be forgotten. They were sentences longer than prison, shorter than life. Salt, silver, lead, gold. The empire ran on minerals, and it used slaves to dig them out. Often convicted criminals were sent here, people Rome had already deemed unworthy of life. But many others were simply unlucky, captives of war, or those sold off by desperate families, or born into a category of human Rome never planned to protect. Imagine descending into a mine before dawn, not walking, crawling, squeezing between damp walls, your feet cut on jagged rock, your skin sticky with the breath of earth. There is no air down here, only dust and the metallic sting of the unknown. Your job is to dig and not to stop. Roman authors wrote of these mines with a kind of detached admiration. Pliny the Elder described their wealth with wonder, noting how deeply Rome could dig into mountains and still find silver. But he never lingered on the workers. They were a means. Their suffering was not part of the yield. Slaves in mines died of everything: starvation, infection, collapse, madness. Their hands cracked and bled. Their eyes adjusted to darkness until daylight became unbearable. Sometimes they went blind entirely, never seeing the sky again. Sleep was short, food was meager, talk was rare, laughter was unheard of, and still they worked. Because the alternative was worse. Above ground, guards waited. Armed men with no interest in mercy. Escape was nearly impossible. The mines were often in remote regions, Spain, Dacia, Sardinia, places where even the land seemed to conspire against flight. And even if you did escape, where would you go? You were marked, dirty, injured, foreign. You didn't speak the language of the towns nearby. You didn't have money. You didn't have a name. No one would shelter you. No one would ask your story. In one letter, a Roman official remarked that slaves in the mines should be used up quickly. It was efficient, he argued, to extract their worth fast. A slow death wasted ore. This was the calculus of empire. But even here, buried in suffering, there were moments. Someone humming an old tune under their breath. A carved symbol passed between hands. A glance that meant, I see you, I still see you. And sometimes, at the end, when a body fell and would not rise, others paused, not long, only seconds, just enough to notice. And then the digging resumed. Rome would not wait. The salt had to come. Not all Roman slaves worked in mines or fields. Some worked in silence, in the tight spaces of Roman homes, away from the public spectacle of auctions and executions. Slavery took on a quieter horror. It whispered instead of shouted. It smiled while it bruised. These were the domestic slaves, those who dressed their masters, bathed their children, trimmed their beards, folded their tunics, and waited, always waited, to be needed or to be punished. There is something uniquely painful about being invisible in plain sight. Imagine a girl, perhaps 14, adjusting the pins in her mistress's hair. The woman frowns, a tug too sharp, a strand out of place. The girl winces before the blow lands. She's learned how to brace without looking scared. Her name is spoken only in reprimand. Her praise, when it comes, is about her silence. She's well trained, they say, doesn't speak unless spoken to. It is meant as a compliment. But what they're really saying is, she's forgotten herself. In wealthy households, a single room might contain 10 kinds of servitude. One slave to pour wine, one to massage sore feet, one to fan the air, one to record accounts, one to recite poetry, one to oversee the others. A hierarchy even in hell. Some envied the domestic slaves. After all, they were indoors. They ate leftovers from the master's table. They wore cast-off tunics instead of rags. They slept on mats instead of floors. But comfort is not freedom. And proximity to power does not soften its sting. In fact, it sharpens it. Because the closer you are, the more dangerous your mistakes. Some of these slaves had their bodies marked not by work, but by desire. Young boys forced to serve as companions. Girls who belonged to men who said they loved them, but could sell them the next day. Old men used as jesters, ridiculed for amusement, beaten for fun. They were not allowed to say no. Roman law permitted any master to use their slaves sexually. Consent was not considered. There were no protections, no recourse, no vocabulary for violation. Pain, in these spaces, was wrapped in luxury. A bathhouse, a perfumed room, a silk-draped couch where a girl learns how to disappear while her body remains. And still, Rome called this civilization. Seneca, in one of his letters, mused that slaves were people too, that they laughed, cried, dreamed. But he didn't free all of his own. He believed in kindness, not justice. And kindness, when it comes from a hand that holds chains, is just another form of control. These domestic slaves, those in the villas and townhouses and palaces, they rarely ran. Not because they were content, but because the walls were too close, the eyes too many. So they endured. They learned how to weep without sound. They learned how to vanish while standing still. And Rome, beautiful and brutal, never noticed. Or maybe it did. But beauty always forgives itself. A tool does not complain. It does not cry when it is cold, or beg when it is hungry. It does not protest when misused. In Rome, this is what slaves were expected to become: tools. Instrumentum, vocalda, talking tool. That was the legal term. So ordinary that it appears in bookkeeping manuals, estate inventories, farming guides. You had oxen, carts, plows and slaves, different categories of usefulness. Same logic, but a tool, of course, cannot feel. So when a slave's body gave out, it was treated as defective equipment. There were doctors in Rome, skilled ones. They could set bones, stitch wounds, even perform eye surgery, but they rarely treated slaves unless they were valuable. A sick slave in a mine, replaceable, an injured cook in a villa, worth fixing if she made the master's favorite stew. Pain was triaged by profit. Some owners did pay for treatment, not out of compassion, but calculation. A trained scribe or tutor cost money to replace. A household servant required discretion, memory, a sense of timing. These things were not easily bought. But medical care did not mean mercy. Roman doctors practiced on slaves. They were experiments in flesh. Galen, one of the most famous physicians in history, described how he learned anatomy by dissecting monkeys. Yes, but also by observing injuries in gladiators and slaves. Some treatments were harsh: boiling oil for wounds, fire to cauterize, vinegar poured into open sores. All done without anesthetic, of course. Just a hand to hold you down, maybe, and always the humiliation. Slaves had no privacy. Their bodies were always seen, always used, always open to comment. Too fat, too thin, too slow, too pretty. No part of them was truly theirs. Even illness could be met with suspicion. You're faking. You want to avoid work. You think this will earn you pity, so they learned to hide pain, to smile with aching limbs, to stand with fevers, to nod while something inside them broke. Even rest was rationed. Cato the Elder recommended minimal sleep for slaves, just enough to function. He believed in regular beatings, not to correct behavior, but to remind them of their place. He called it maintenance, like oiling a hinge, like sharpening a blade. The irony, of course, is that slaves were more than tools. They remembered, they felt, they aged, and when their bodies finally failed, when arthritis made them slow, or eyes dimmed, or backs bent too far, they were often discarded. Some were sold, some were sent to work in less visible places. Garbage pits, burial grounds, the night crew for street cleaning. Some were left to die. Rome did not pension off its tools. There were rare exceptions. An old nurse remembered fondly, a loyal steward buried with a touching epitaph. But these stories are rare for a reason. They were not the rule. They were the guilt. Most died unnamed, bent, broken, used. And Rome, so proud of its marble and mosaics, stood atop their bones. The Roman world, at its height, stretched from northern Britain to the deserts of Arabia. It was a marvel of engineering roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, walls, so precise, so enduring, that remnants of it still shape our cities today. But if you follow the stones back to their source, if you ask who carved them, who lifted them, who bled into the foundations, then the grandeur dims. The empire was not built by emperors. It was built by hands that left no names behind. Slaves, thousands of them, constructed Rome's glory. Skilled labor was not always free labor. Some of the finest artisans, architects, and builders were enslaved. Captured Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, men trained in geometry, stonework, metallurgy were brought to Rome not as honored guests, but as property. They designed colonnades and arches they would never walk under as citizens. They laid tiles they would not be allowed to sit upon. They crafted sculptures that bore the faces of men who owned them. This was the cruelest symmetry, beauty created by those who were considered beneath it. Rome's monuments, those towering forums, those echoing baths, those grand arenas, were less a celebration of culture and more a testimony to enforced labor. Every marble block rolled into place by back-breaking effort, every column polished by aching fingers. Sometimes inscriptions named the architects, rarely the workers, and yet their fingerprints are everywhere. In the misaligned bricks of a hastily built barracks, in the subtle curve of a mosaic eye, in the iron clamps hidden deep inside the Colosseum's bones. And the irony, some of these slaves were educated, more so than their masters. A Greek slave might recite Homer from memory. A Syrian artisan might speak 3 languages. A scribe could write in both cursive Latin and formal Greek. But none of that saved them from being called Ricer thing. Because in Rome, brilliance meant nothing without bloodline. The labor force was not merely muscle, it was mind. Enslaved tutors taught Roman children their letters. Enslaved accountants managed estates. Enslaved doctors performed surgeries. Some masters trusted their slaves with their lives, but not with freedom, not with identity, not with respect. Even gladiators, those mythologized fighters of sand and blood, were often slaves. Trained in brutal schools, their pain sold as entertainment. They fought not for honor, but survival. And when they died, it was with no eulogy, no grave, unless a rare benefactor intervened. To say that slaves built Rome is not metaphor, it is geography. Their hands carved the city's face. Their sweat salted its soil. Their deaths paved its triumph. And yet, when the poets sang of Rome's greatness, they praised the emperors, the generals, the gods, not the builder who fell from the scaffold, not the girl who swept the dust before dawn, not the old man who shaped stone with shaking hands, knowing he would never be free to touch it once it stood. Rome remembered its marble, but not the ones who bled to raise it. To be born in chains is not just to be born poor, it is to be born without a future. In Rome, If your mother was a slave, so were you. No matter your father's status, no matter where you were born, no matter how much you cried, from the first breath, your life belonged to someone else. This was not a metaphor. It was legal fact. Partis sequitur ventrum, the child follows the womb. The law declared that the status of a child followed that of the mother, not the father. It didn't matter if the father was a citizen, a freedman, or even the master himself. If your mother was enslaved, so were you. You entered the world already owned. There was no cradle, no lullaby, no dream of more. Roman households often used enslaved women as wet nurses. These women bore their own children, often in secret, often during stolen hours, and then they fed the children of others. Imagine that, nourishing a child who will grow up to command you, while your own child is taken away, sold, or simply ignored. Some masters allowed slave children to remain with their mothers for a while. Others did not. Babies were commodities. If they survived infancy, they could be put to work by the age of 5. Carrying water, fetching firewood, running errands, learning their place. There was no school for these children, no holidays, no birthday cakes or toys. Their games mimicked their labor. Pretend cooking, pretend cleaning, pretend obedience. They learned to bow before they learned to read. They learned to smile before they understood why they had to. Sometimes, these children were raised alongside their master's children. They played together, at first, shared toys, shared songs, shared secrets, but the line always came. One would grow into a citizen, the other a servant. One would learn to command, the other to obey. One might become a senator, the other a slave who dresses him. It didn't matter how close they had once been. Bloodlines mattered, freedom mattered, and affection was not strong enough to cross that gulf. Occasionally, masters manumitted their house-born slaves when they reached adulthood. It was seen as noble. But even then, the freedom was conditional. A freedman remained tied to the household, and the child of a freedman still viewed with suspicion. The stain of origin never quite washed away. There were rumors, always, of children born from coercion, masters fathering children with enslaved women, sometimes openly, sometimes violently. These children lived in a strange limbo. They might be given special treatment, or they might be denied entirely. They might inherit a name, or be sold to avoid scandal. Their fates were as inconsistent as the moods of the men who sired them. But one rule held: if their mother was in chains, so were they. It didn't matter if their blood held the same iron as their master's sword. Rome believed in order, and nothing disrupted order more than empathy. So the chain continued. Through womb, through cradle, through every stolen childhood, the empire marched forward, fed by generations who never had a first chance, who never knew what it meant to be free, even in dreams. In the back rooms of Rome, where masters didn't linger, something rare and difficult was always trying to survive. Love, between the cracks of ownership and surveillance. Among people who were not allowed to be people, bonds still formed. Friendships, partnerships, quiet, fierce attachments that Roman law refused to acknowledge. Because love, in slavery, was resistance. Slaves could not legally marry. There were no ceremonies, no rights, no protections. A man and woman might pledge themselves to each other, might live together, raise children together, mourn each other, but the law would never call them husband and wife. There was a word for their union: contubernium. It means tenturing, a soldier's word. Practical, temporary, deniable. Even affection had to be bureaucratic. and yet people loved anyway. They whispered to each other in kitchens, touched hands in corridors, sang to each other in dialects no master understood. They exchanged small gifts, worn talismans, fruit snuck from the garden. In their brief hours of rest, they made homes out of straw and tenderness, but nothing was guaranteed. A master could separate them at any time, sell one, relocate the other, punish both for disobedience. There were no appeals, no documents to prove their bond. Sometimes they begged, sometimes they ran, sometimes they let go because the heartbreak of staying was easier than the hope of being torn apart. In rare cases, a master allowed slave couples to stay together, not from compassion, but convenience. Two people housed as one, a shared child to grow into labor, a reduction in complaints. Even then, fear hovered, because affection made you vulnerable. To love another slave meant living in constant dread that you'd lose them. Every night might be your last together. Every knock at the door might mean a sale, a punishment, a goodbye without goodbye. Even jealousy had no outlet. If your partner was summoned by the master, you could not protest, you could not ask, you could not rage. You could only wait and listen and pretend not to know. Sometimes the only mercy was forgetting, and sometimes forgetting felt like betrayal. Children born of these unions were rarely allowed to stay with both parents. Often they were raised communally. Older slaves helped care for younger ones. Affection was shared like bread thinly, generously, knowing it might be the only thing not taken away. And still, people found each other, found ways to love in the shadow of ownership, to whisper mine in a world that only saw his. There is something deeply human about that, about loving when love is forbidden, about choosing someone again and again when the world keeps trying to tear you apart. These were not the love stories Rome wanted to write. They weren't carved into marble or sung in verse, but they existed. And in a world where people were called tools, where emotions were treated like weaknesses, every stolen moment of affection was a small, powerful revolt. The kind of love that didn't need permission, because it already knew it was real. There's a way of speaking that only emerges when speaking is dangerous. In ancient Rome, enslaved people learned quickly that words could betray them. A wrong answer, an untimely silence, even a truth too boldly spoken, any of these could invite punishment. So they developed a new language, not with grammar, with glances, with posture, with presence. It was the language of obedience. To a Roman master, a good slave was quiet, deferential, efficient. He anticipated needs. She disappeared when no longer required. They made themselves small, not just physically, but spiritually. This wasn't just performance, it was survival. Every interaction was layered. You said yes, but not too quickly. You offered your opinion only when asked. You avoided eye contact unless it was expected. You learned the moods of your owners like tideswind to approach, when to vanish, when to flatter, and always the risk of misreading. Slaves in Rome were expected to be grateful, to smile when praised, to show remorse when scolded, even if the praise was for something humiliating, even if the scolding was unjust. If they protested even gently, they could be beaten. If they resisted, they could be tortured. If they ran, they could be killed. So they adapted. They created layers within their language. What appeared to be obedience was often something else. A delay crafted to avoid a beating. A compliment worded to cover a hidden insult. A blank face hiding grief. Some used humor, a kind of irony masked as flattery. Others used silence, the most universal defense. In large households, where many slaves worked together, they developed codes, phrases that sounded innocent to outsiders, but carried meaning. A warning, a reassurance, a plan. Even gestures carried weight. A finger held to the chest might mean, "I understand." A tilt of the head, "Be careful." A hand placed on a doorframe, "I'll wait." Because they had to communicate under surveillance, they became masters of nuance. But it came at a cost. Pretending becomes practice. Practice becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. And sometimes they forgot who they had been before the performance began. What did your voice sound like when it didn't tremble? What would it mean to speak without consequence? To say no and remain whole? These were questions too dangerous to ask. Some Roman writers noticed this. They mocked slaves for being two-faced, said they smiled too much, laughed too loudly, plotted too quietly. But what else could they do? They were surrounded by people who believed they had no soul, no depth, no self. And so they created a self in secret, with coded words, with practiced nods, with the silence that said more than any speech could. Because even in chains, the mind looks for language. And even under surveillance, the spirit speaks. In Rome, trust was dangerous currency. For the enslaved, to be trusted by a master was both a privilege and a trap. It meant access, maybe even influence, but also exposure. The closer you stood to power, the easier it was to be crushed by it. Some slaves became familiar, a Bano-urban household staff, the elite among the enslaved. Within this hierarchy, a select few were chosen for even more delicate roles. Stewards, secretaries, accountants, body servants, even advisors. These were the servi literati, the literate slaves. They kept ledgers, drafted letters, memorized laws, whispered advice into their master's ear during legal disputes or political maneuvering. They knew secrets. They handled money. They forged signatures. They were indispensable and entirely expendable, because trust in this world was never a gift. It was leverage. Masters trusted their educated slaves not because they believed in their loyalty, but because they believed in their dependence. A smart slave had nowhere else to go. His intelligence made him valuable, but only in captivity. If he ran, he'd be hunted harder. If he succeeded, he'd be envied more. Sometimes, these slaves tried to buy their freedom, saving coins in secret, striking informal bargains, hoping, praying, that loyalty would be rewarded. But trust was fragile. A single rumor could undo it. A jealous peer, a failed business deal, a mistress who grew suspicious. He speaks too well. He's too confident. He thinks he's more than he is. And then just like that, tit was over. Back to rough clothes. Back to punishments. Back to the cellars. The fall from favor was worse than never being noticed at all. But the deeper cruelty was internal. To be trusted, these slaves had to betray parts of themselves. They had to watch others suffer while they stood still. They had to nod while friends were whipped. They had to account for expenses that included other people's bodies. And at night, they had to sleep with that knowledge. To be close to power is to become part of its machinery. Some believed they could change things from the inside, protect others, ease the worst of it. Some even did. But the system did not bend easily. For every act of protection, there was an expectation of loyalty. For every minor mercy, 100 small silences. You learned to keep secrets. Not just for your master, but from yourself. Because if you looked too closely, if you truly saw the weight of your complicity, you might not survive the guilt. So they compartmentalized. This wasn't me. I was just doing my duty. I had no choice. And sometimes that was true. But it didn't make the burden lighter. In Rome, trust was a chain with velvet lining. And once you wore it, you had to pretend it didn't chafe. Not every act of resistance looks like fire. In Rome, most slaves did not rise in arms. They did not burn villas or stab their masters in the night. They could not afford open rebellion. The price was too high, the retaliation too swift. But that did not mean they obeyed. Rebellion, for many, was quieter, slower, woven into the rhythm of the day. A dish served cold, a chore left unfinished, a message whispered too late, a tool mysteriously misplaced. It was subtle sabotage, and sometimes it was just survival, refusing to break, refusing to forget, holding on to a name, a story, a prayer, keeping something private in a world where everything was supposed to be owned. Some slaves carved symbols into walls, fragments of language from homes long gone. Some sang in foreign tongues, their voices low, their melodies strange to Roman ears. Some lit candles to gods their masters had never heard of. Each act, however small, was a refusal, a way of saying, I am still here. There were bolder forms, too. Some slaves feigned illness to avoid work. Others learned the laws of manumission and used them to their advantage, negotiating, saving, maneuvering. Some ran, even knowing the risks. Some tried to free others. Some organized escapes. In the countryside, there were whispers of runaway communities, bands of fugitives hiding in forests or hills, living by theft and luck. Few lasted long. Rome hunted them ruthlessly, but their stories lingered, ghosts of freedom. And then there were the revolts, the ones historians remember. Like the rebellion of Spartacus, gladiator turned rebel leader. He gathered tens of thousands of slaves and marched across Italy, winning battles, challenging the might of Rome itself. For 2 years, the empire trembled, but in the end, it crushed them. 6,000 crucifixions lined the Appian Way, a warning carved in flesh and wood. Rome would not tolerate defiance. Still, for every Spartacus, there were 1,000 unnamed rebels. Not warriors, but people who refused to let their spirits be owned. A mother teaching her child to dream. A boy who told jokes behind his master's back. A girl who refused to cry when punished. These two were rebellions. Small, fierce, unrecorded, because rebellion doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And in a world that demands silence, a whisper can be the loudest sound of all. There is a particular stillness that lives in the moment before you are sold. Not fear, exactly. Not even dread. Something colder. A kind of hollow quiet, like standing at the edge of a cliff while the wind decides if it will push you. This was the silence before the Roman slave market opened its gates. It was not one place. There were many markets. In Rome itself, beneath the shadow of the Capitoline Hill. In Delos, once the busiest slave market in the Mediterranean. In Ephesus, in Carthage. In every major city, there were corners, plazas, pens, always full, always watched. They were called venalia, public auctions. You didn't need to ask directions. You could follow the smell of sweat, of fear, of oil used to make skin shine. You could follow the sounds barking orders, the slap of sandals on stone, the practiced voice of the mango, the slave dealer, calling out prices as if selling goats. Slaves were arranged by type. Young women, usually stripped to prove youth and health. Boys with fine features, displayed for buyers with specific tastes. Men divided by skill cooks, smiths, scribes, fighters. Families often separated. Husbands told to smile as wives were led away. Mothers told not to cry too loudly. You stood where you were told. You answered when asked. If you were lucky, your dealer gave you water. If not, you stood in heat until your knees gave out. And then you were whipped because collapsing made you look weak. Placards hung around necks. Good teeth. Speaks both Greek and Latin. No known illnesses. Sometimes the signs lied. Sometimes they didn't. Buyers came with lists. Some came with doctors. Some came with boys to test strength, agility, docility. One slap to the face, and the buyer watches. Does he flinch? Does she retaliate? A good slave is one who doesn't react. There were customs, rules. Roman law required sellers to disclose known defects. Was the slave sick? Did they have a habit of running? Had they committed crimes? Some dealers obeyed, others lied. If caught, they paid a fine. The slave, of course, paid more. The irony is almost unbearable. People sold like objects, yet blamed for their own quality. You were not worth your price. You looked stronger when I bought you. You were supposed to be loyal. In some cases, slaves were sold with warranties, time-limited guarantees of function. If a defect appeared too soon, a refund might be offered. If a buyer was disappointed, they might trade you back. Like a horse with a limp. But not always. Sometimes you were sold as is. The Latin phrase was si quid inficiator. Something is denied. It meant no guarantees, no returns. And you, the slave, stood in the middle of this cold legality, watching your life be bartered like pottery. Worse still, you might be sold again and again. Passed from hand to hand, each new owner reshaping your fate like a potter with half-dried clay. Some slaves were bought for kindness. Most were not. Some were bought for sex, for cruelty, for sport, for revenge. Some were bought as gifts. Happy birthday. Here's a boy from Numidia. Rome did not hide these things. It displayed them. And if you stood there long enough naked, aching, trying not to cry, you began to understand what Rome really valued. Not people, usefulness, obedience, silence. How much are you worth? In Rome, it was not a philosophical question. It was math, recorded, calculated, written on receipts. A slave's value depended on many things: age, health, skills, beauty, even temperament, but never their will, never their story, only their yield. A strong laborer might sell for 2,000 sesterces, a skilled scribe maybe 5,000, a Greek tutor more, a girl described as beautiful, compliant, musical, priceless to the wrong kind of buyer. And yet, the coin passed hands just the same. You could stand next to another person, same age, same tongue, same birthplace, and find yourself worth half as much, because your teeth weren't straight, because your left leg was slightly bowed, because you spoke too slowly, because the buyer simply didn't like the shape of your face. And in that moment, you realized you weren't being evaluated, you were being measured. Like grain, like marble, like wool, a commodity. There were taxes involved. The state took its cut. Dealers took theirs. Some slaves were sold in bulk, like livestock. Others were auctioned singly, like luxury goods. The paperwork was precise. Names, if known, were recorded. Origins estimated. Age guessed. Condition summarized. And then price. Cicero once sold several slaves to settle debts. Pliny the Younger bought slaves in batches to staff country estates. One Roman general is said to have sold thousands of captives after a single victory, a bloodied spreadsheet stretching across the provinces. And yet, in all these transactions, one detail was constant. The slave had no voice. You could not object, could not counteroffer, could not ask who your new owner was, or what city you were being taken to, or whether your child was sold before or after you. If you spoke, it was at your own risk. Many learned early to stay quiet. A wrong word could lower your price. A visible flaw could doom your chances. Ironically, a higher price sometimes meant better treatment, an investment worth protecting. So you hoped to be expensive, and hated yourself for it. Some tried to influence their fate, smiling, standing tall, speaking sweetly. Others did the opposites, louching, feigning lameness, praying to be passed over. It depended on what you feared more, being bought by someone cruel, or not being bought at all, because unsold slaves didn't go home. They went to storage, cells, pens, dungeons below the market, days without light, food, or certainty, waiting for the next auction, for the next set of eyes, for another chance to be measured. And all the while, the question echoed not just in your own mind, but in the minds of everyone watching you. What is this one worth? Not who is this? Not what have they lived through? Not what might they become? Just price, a number, a sale. And then the next one. Every sale began with a voice that was not yours. The auctioneer's voice, smooth and practiced, filled the space. His words carried through the open air or echoed against the marble halls of the private auction house. He introduced you not with your name but with your uses. Good teeth, healthy liver, no known illnesses, raised in a Greek-speaking household, obedient, shows potential. You stood behind those words like a curtain you could not push aside. Because in the Roman world, language was power, and the enslaved were not allowed to have it. You could speak, of course, you could speak. Many Roman slaves knew multiple languages, Latin, Greek, Egyptian, Punic. Some were better educated than their masters. They quoted Homer and copied Virgil by hand. They translated contracts and kept accounts, but none of that gave them a voice. Not in court, not in law, not in sale. You could be questioned during an auction, but your answers meant little. You were expected to speak only to confirm what the dealer claimed. If you said something unexpected or, worse, unpleasant, you might be struck, or gagged, or simply sold more quickly to a buyer who didn't care what you had to say. Language became another chain. You had to use the words your owner preferred. You had to remember titles, greetings, boundaries. Call the mistress Domina, the master Dominus. Refer to yourself in the third person. Never I want or I fear. Always this one begs or the slave regrets. Even in private, speech was monitored. Your conversations with other slaves were expected to be brief, practical. Talking too much, especially in a language the master did not understand, could arouse suspicion. They're planning something. They're discontent. They're remembering who they were. And so, many chose silence. Not because they lacked thought, but because they knew what language could cost. Still, some found ways to speak. They whispered after dark, in kitchens, in bathhouses, in stables. Their tongues danced carefully, wrapping meaning in riddles, laughter, and metaphor. They kept old songs alive, tunes from home, repurposed with new words, new grief. In those songs, you could find everything Rome refused to hear. Mothers calling for sons taken too young, lovers separated by sale, friends marking the memory of those who died without farewell. Even the act of remembering a language and ancestral tongue no master understood became a form of defiance. A hidden garden, untouched by Roman law, because to hold your words inside you was to hold yourself, to preserve what could not be sold. And while the auctioneer's voice rang out, promising obedience, skill, silence, somewhere inside you a different voice whispered, "I am not yours." If you were sold in the morning, you could be orphaned by noon. This was not an accident. It was design. Roman slavery did not recognize families among the enslaved. A mother might raise her child with tenderness, with lullabies, with prayers, but in the eyes of the law, that child was not hers. He belonged to the master, like a calf born to another man's herd. There were no marriage certificates, no kinship protections. A slave's body could be sold, so could her child, so could her lover, at any time, for any reason, without warning. And so the market was full of absences. Empty hands, once held by fathers. Empty laps, once warmed by daughters. The invisible, aching hollows where love had once dared to root. Sometimes families were brought to the market together. A man, his wife, their children. They stood in line, holding hands, not knowing if the next hour would be the last they spent as a unit. Buyers rarely purchased families whole, too expensive, too inefficient. They preferred to choose one, maybe two. "I'll take the boy," they'd say, "looks strong." Or, "The mother's still young, might bear more," and the rest were left behind. Some begged, publicly, on their knees. Others bit their lips until they bled, because if you wept too hard, you could be punished, labeled troublesome, driven down in price. And if your child saw you panic, it might frighten the buyer. No one wanted a screaming child on a cart home, so you taught them to be brave. Even now, you whispered, "Be still, be polite, don't cry," even as your voice broke, even as your heart shattered. And when they were led away tied, sometimes, or lifted into carts you waved, you smiled, if you could, because it was the last gift you had to give, a peaceful goodbye. Some children were too young to understand. They called for their mothers for days, until silence settled into them like frost. Others adapted quickly, becoming the perfect servant fear made into posture, and some never stopped mourning. There are Roman epitaphs carved by freedmen years later, mentioning the names of mothers and siblings lost at market. Tiny names, forgotten names. Names said aloud only in the quietest rooms, behind locked doors, after dark. Because remembering too was an act of rebellion, a declaration against the amnesia of empire. Rome believed it could erase families and replace them with property. But blood remembers. So does grief. And somewhere, in the shadow of every villa and auction block, a mother still called a name Rome did not bother to record. There was a moment, sometimes, just before the sale, when the buyer would look you in the eyes. It wasn't long, a second, maybe two. Enough to make you think there was something more behind the transaction. A flicker of curiosity, a spark of recognition. The lie that said, "I see you," but it was only that a lie, because this wasn't a choice. Not for you. You didn't choose to stand on the platform. You didn't choose the oil they rubbed on your arms to make your skin shine. You didn't choose the name on the placard. You didn't choose who touched your hair, your shoulders, your waist, as if testing fruit for bruises. And when the hand was raised, when the price was called, and the auctioneer nodded, you didn't choose to go. You walked because someone else told you to. The illusion was only for the buyer. They believed they were choosing wisely, a slave who wouldn't run, A slave who might sing. A slave who looked like they wouldn't die too soon. They squinted at your teeth, your feet, your thighs, and imagined they were judging quality. They weren't. They were choosing who they wanted to hurt, in what way, and for how long. The process was wrapped in ceremony. A clerk nearby scribbled your namif, no nor, simply Gol, Numidian. Girl, your weight, approximate. Your value, estimated. Your future, unspoken. Sometimes you were led to your new owner immediately. Other times you were kept overnight chained with others, trembling under thin blankets, listening for footsteps. You might try to guess. Was the man who bought you kind? Would he feed you? Would he keep you near the house, or send you to the fields? No one answered, because you weren't supposed to ask. Your value had already been measured, your story already buried, and the worst part, you were supposed to be grateful. To the dealer who sold you, to the man who bought you, to the law that called you property, then punished you for acting like a person. You were expected to nod, to smile, to say gracias agoy, thank you, even if you couldn't breathe, even if your child had just been led away, even if you had been bought for reasons no one dared speak aloud, because anything else would be defiance. And Rome did not forgive defiance. It forgave obedience. It forgave silence. It forgave the illusion that this was all orderly, necessary, even civilized. But choice was a dream you were forced to forget. And so, with chains around your wrists, and strangers watching, you stepped into your new life quietly, as if you had chosen it. The lash did not just punish the body. It reminded the rest of the room who owned the rules. In the Roman world, punishment was not a last resort. It was a routine, a performance, a ritual designed not to reform, but to reinforce. Slaves were not citizens. They had no rights to trial, no protection under law. A master's word was law, and discipline was its shadow. You could be whipped for speaking out of turn, for looking away, for looking too long, for breathing when silence was expected, for failing to finish a task on time, or finishing it too quickly and making your master feel slow. Some owners liked to punish publicly, a kind of theatre. A boy is dragged into the atrium. The family is dining. The master rises from his couch. With a few sharp words, he gestures. A lumbos, a leather strap, is produced. The boy's tunic is torn open. He is struck, once, twice, 10 times. The guests sip wine. Some glance. Most don't. It is not cruel. It is corrective. It is discipline. It is necessary, they say, to maintain order. A household must have order. And the boy he will not disobey again. Or so they hope. But pain is not always educational. Sometimes it's just pain. Rome had many instruments for punishment. The whip, of course, but also the furca, a yoke placed around the neck and arms, forcing the wearer to stoop in shame. The flagrum, with metal or bone at the tips, for deeper wounds. The pessa, a wooden clog for feet, to prevent running. Some punishments left no scars, just fear. Others left scars that lasted a lifetime. In the mines, punishment was near constant. A missed quota, a stolen fig, a whispered prayer each, one might bring a blow. There was no audience, only darkness and the sound of skin splitting open. In the household, the cruelty was quieter. A girl might be slapped for speaking. A man might be denied food for a week. A child might be made to sleep in a cage for laughing too loudly. These weren't rules, they were whims. Because punishment wasn't just about wrongdoing. It was about reminding you that you could be punished at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all. And still you had to smile. Still you had to bow, because to show anger was to court death. To protest was to invite worse. And so slaves learned to live in anticipation, not just of the pain, but of the possibility of pain. That waiting, that constant tension, was a punishment of its own. And Rome, it called this order. It built its empire on this silence. It decorated its villas with mosaics, while beneath them people wept when no one could hear. And when the punishment ended, when the bleeding stopped, when the cage was opened, when the bruises faded, the memory remained. A bruise beneath the skin, a fear behind the eyes, a discipline that didn't need to be repeated. Because once you've been broken, once you've been punished in front of others, you start to punish yourself. To run was to dream out loud. In a world where every breath was regulated, every step monitored, escape was the loudest thing a slave could do. Not because it made noise, but because it defied the very premise of ownership. It said, "I am not a tool, I am not a thing, I am not yours." Rome responded with fury. Runaway slaves were fugitivi. The term carried weight. It didn't just mean absent, it meant ungrateful, dangerous, a threat to the social order. Because if one person escaped and lived, what might that inspire in the others? The response had to be severe. Punishments for runaways varied. At minimum, whipping, branding, isolation. The brand was usually on the forehead. Thug, so everyone would know. So escape would never again be an option. So even freedom, if it ever came, would wear a scar. Some were forced to wear iron collars with inscriptions. "I have run away. Catch me. Return me to my master." These weren't just warnings. They were humiliations made permanent. If you ran twice, you could be hamstring your Achilles tendon severed. You'd never run again. Not well. If you ran with others, if you organized, plotted, planned, that was conspiracy. That was rebellion. That was crucifixion. Roman law allowed a master to execute his own slaves without trial. But when it came to fugitives, the state often stepped in. A public example, a spectacle, a deterrent. Some masters nailed warnings on city walls. 3 denarii for the capture of a Numidian boy, age 15, branded on the left arm. 10 denarii for the return of a Syrian girl, speaks Latin poorly, may pretend to be deaf. The posters treated people like stolen goods, and the city watched. Sometimes citizens returned fugitives for the reward. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they helped, offering water, a place to sleep, a change of clothing. But helping a slave was illegal. Even kindness could be punished. Still, people ran into the woods, into the mountains, into the maze of Rome itself, where anonymity might be found in the crush of bodies and smoke. Some were caught within days, some within hours, but some disappeared. Some were never found. They changed their names, hid among the poor, passed for free. They lived in alleys, begged for scraps, married in secret, built lives from shadows. It was not freedom, not entirely. It was hunger, fear, exhaustion. But it was chosen, and that made all the difference. They were hunted not just with nets and chains, but with stories. Rome called them criminals, ungrateful, dangerous, subhuman. But what was the crime, really? To want a name of your own. To want your child to wake up unafraid. To walk where you pleased, sleep when tired, speak without trembling. If that was treason, then treason became a prayer, and running a kind of grace. Even if it ended in capture, even if it ended in death. Because for a few hours, a few days, you were not property. You were a person, and that alone was worth the risk. In the Roman courtroom, truth had a price. And if you were a slave, that price was pain. Roman law did not trust the word of an enslaved person. Not in court, not under oath, not in writing. A slave could not be believed unless tortured. That was the logic. That was the method. It was called quaestio, per tormented inquiry through torment. The idea was ancient, simple, brutal. Pain reveals truth. So when a case came before a magistrate about theft, about murder, about anything involving the household and slaves were involved, they were not asked to testify. They were tortured, not because they were suspects, not because they were guilty, but because their bodies were considered vessels of hidden knowledge, and only pain could unlock them. A man is accused of poisoning his wife. The household slaves are brought forward, not to speak, but to scream. Their feet are crushed, their skin flayed, their joints dislocated. The magistrate listens, notes their cries, watches for confession. If one breaks and names a fellow slaven, the round begins. If none confess, perhaps they are loyal, or perhaps they're still lying. So the pain continues. And somewhere, amid the blood and breathlessness, a decision is made. Justice, the Romans said, was being served. But what kind of justice relies on agony? Sometimes the slaves themselves were the victims accused of plotting, of stealing, of lying. They could not defend themselves. Their word meant nothing without wounds, and even then it might not be enough. Torture was not precise. It did not guarantee truth, but it created the illusion of effort, of inquiry, of order, and that was enough. We have records, cold, detailed, meticulous, instructions for how to bind limbs, for how to space the lashes, for how long a person might be pressed before organs failed. It was clinical, as if the law had confused truth with anatomy. The elite watched these rituals with a sense of control. They believed they were administering justice. They believed the screams meant the system worked. But beneath that confidence was fear. Fear that the enslaved knew too much. Fear that silence might shelter conspiracy. Fear that suffering might not be enough. And so they leaned on torture not for justice, but for reassurance, for spectacle, for proof that they still held the power. And the slaves, they endured. Some confessed to anything, just to make it stop. Some refused and died without a word. Some turned on each other. Some whispered lies to protect others. And all of them knew this was not about truth. This was about breaking something so that Rome could pretend it had listened. Because when your voice only matters in agony, that is not testimony, that is sacrifice. There are cities that punish in silence. Rome was not one of them. When a slave defied the order of things, ran, stole, fought back, or simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time, the punishment wasn't always hidden behind villa walls or in the pitiless dark of a cellar. Sometimes it was performed in the forum, on the steps of temples, in the amphitheater, because punishment wasn't just correction, it was instruction, a message carved in blood, written across the flesh of the disobedient, and read by all who dared to hope. This was most visible in the arena. Gladiators, yes, fought for glory and survival, but others, the damnati ad bestias, the condemned to beasts, were often enslaved people, punished not for crimes, but for disobedience, for escape, for being in the wrong household at the wrong moment. These executions were not quiet affairs. They were theater. A slave led into the arena, naked, hands bound. A lion released. A crowd leaning forward, not with pity, but with hunger for excitement, for power, for the affirmation that they were not the one being eaten. Sometimes the slaves were made to fight each other. Sometimes they were made to act out mythological death, Sisyphus, Orpheus, theatre twisted into execution. The irony was bitter. A person forced to die playing the role of someone already dead. Outside the amphitheatre, public punishments were smaller, but no less cruel. A runaway paraded through the streets in chains. A branded forehead bleeding in the heat. A mother flogged in front of her child. The punishment was always public, always meant to be remembered. For the Romans, this visibility was proof of civilization. Barbarians killed in chaos. Rome punished with order. They even had categories for it. Some crimes warranted crucifixio crucifixion, reserved mostly for slaves, especially those accused of violence. It was slow, deliberate. You did not die quickly. You died over days, exposed to sun, insects, mockery. Others were sentenced to supplicium de mor maiorumtha, ancient punishment, bound in a sack with a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake, then thrown into the river. Rome did not lack creativity, but what it lacked entirely was shame. Punishment was spectacle because fear was currency. You couldn't rule an empire with kindness, but you could rule it with memory. Make people remember the sting of a lash they never received. Make them remember a scream they didn't voice. Make them tremble at the sight of blood, and promise never to ask why it was spilled. And so the streets of Rome bore witness, not just to power, but to cruelty. Celebrated, institutionalized, forgotten only by those who never had to fear it. For everyone else, it was the air they breathed, a lesson carved into the city's spine. This is what happens when you forget your place. In 61 before Common Era, a slave murdered his master. The details are lost: his name, his reasons, whether it was rage or desperation or something colder. But we know what came next. The master was a Roman official, wealthy, well-connected. His death sent tremors through the Senate. Not because one man had died, but because the unthinkable had happened. A slave had turned. Under Roman law, when a slave killed a master, all the slaves in the household, every man, woman, and child, were to be executed. Not just the killer, all of them, whether they were present or absent, whether they tried to intervene or hide, whether they had begged the killer to stop or knew nothing at all. That was the law. In this case, there were 400 slaves in the household. The public cried out. Senators hesitated. Some said it was too much, that children should be spared, that women in service, cooks, and porters should not suffer for a single act. But the law did not bend, and so the sentence was carried out. 400 people executed, slowly, publicly, as a warning. What was the logic? That fear binds more tightly than chains. Rome had no illusions about loyalty. It didn't trust slaves to be faithful out of affection. It demanded obedience through collective terror. If one rebelled, all would pay. If one plotted, all would bleed. If one ran, the rest would be watched more closely. It was punishment as infection control. You were not punished only for your actions. You were punished for your proximity. And this was not rare. A cook drops a plate in a villa 5 lashes. A servant forgets to close a door 3 beaten. A whisper of conspiracy 10 sold off in silence. Their names struck from the ledger. Their beds reassigned by nightfall. Guilt was collective. Justice was group discipline. Some masters prided themselves on precision. I only punish the guilty, they said. But even then, the guilty were named by suspicion, by whispers, by guesses. A missed task, a sudden glance, a servant standing too near the master's wine. And sometimes punishment was insurance. If I punish them now, a master might say, they'll think twice later. The cruelty was preemptive, and the enslaved learned to fear not just their own mistakes, but each other's, to watch their neighbor, to distrust their friend, to keep secrets, because even love could get you killed. And Rome, ever proud of its laws, saw no contradiction. A slave was not a person. A slave was part of a household. And if one part failed, the whole body could be amputated, not to save it, but to prove who held the knife. To be enslaved in Rome was not just to labor, it was to perform. Every day was a stage, and every role was assigned, not by merit, not by desire, but by ownership. You woke not as yourself, but as someone else's version of you. In the grand households of Rome, slaves were given functions, but these functions were more than jobs. They were personas, roles you played so well, your own reflection might stop recognizing you. There was the pure delicatas, the delicate boy, chosen for beauty, trained for elegance, treated as a pet, a symbol, sometimes worse. He stood beside his master in public, dressed in fine linen, not for warmth, but for show. There was the Nutrix, the nursemaid. Her body fed children who were not her own. Her hands cleaned wounds that were not hers. Her lullabies were sung in languages the child would grow to forget. There was the lector, the reader, educated in poetry, rhetoric, law. His task was to read aloud for his master's pleasure, even as his own thoughts were forbidden. Each one wore a mask, not literal, but social, emotional, psychological. To be useful, a slave had to become predictable. If you were too quiet, they said you were sullen. If you were too friendly, they said you were insolent. If you dared to be still, they called you lazy. If you smiled, it had to be at the right moment, at the right person, with the right intention. Even grief had its timing. If your child died and your master's guests arrived, you were expected to serve wine with dry eyes. This was not just dehumanization, it was distortion. The Roman elite needed their slaves to be human enough to work, but not so human as to provoke sympathy. They needed emotion when it flattered. They needed silence when it suited. And they needed the enslaved to forget the difference between obedience and personality. So slaves learned to shape themselves. A girl became cheerful, even when hurting. A man became deferential, even when humiliated. A boy became graceful, even when terrified, because safety was often found in consistency. If the master expected you to be charming, you were charming. If the mistress expected tears, you cried. If the guests expected laughter, you laughed never too loudly, never too long. It was a performance, but one with real stakes. To forget your line could mean a lash. To break character could mean a sale. To speak your truth could mean death. And over time, the roles fused to the skin, so that even when alone scrubbing floors, cleaning wounds, sweeping ashes, the mask remained. Because forgetting to wear it might mean forgetting who you needed to be to stay alive. Rome loved theatre, but for its enslaved, the play never ended. It began each morning with the sound of a master's voice, and it ended only when the curtain finally fell. Rome loved spectacle. It was not enough to conquer, to command, to construct. It had to perform, to display power as beauty, to turn domination into art, and within that art, slaves became props. Some were entertainers, singers, dancers, musicians, mimes, not because they wanted to be, because they had been trained, or noticed, or shaped into instruments of someone else's amusement. Theatres across the empire pulsed with applause, laughter, song. But beneath the masks and liars were people who had never been free to choose silence. A girl from Syria, taught to dance in chains, was praised for her graceful suffering. A boy from Thrace, forced to play the cithara at banquets, bowed at the end of each song, not out of pride, but because not bowing meant a slap. Even laughter had its volume monitored. Too loud, and you became disruptive. Too soft, and you were ungrateful. There was a sweet spot for everything, and missing it could cost you your supper. But the cruelest role was not the entertainer. It was the displayed. Some slaves were kept not to perform, but simply to be looked at. They were chosen for beauty, for strangeness, for size, for color. A girl with pale eyes from Gaul, a boy with dark skin from Nubia, a child with golden hair, silent and always smiling. They were dressed like dolls, paraded like pets. Their silence was expected, their stillness praised. They sat beside fountains. They stood in doorways. They followed their owners through the streets like walking jewelry. They were not meant to speak, only to reflect the wealth of the person who owned them. To possess a rare slave was like possessing a rare gem. It said, "I am powerful. I am cultured. I own something you do not." And the slave, they learned to become scenery, to smile on command, to hold still while fingers traced their arms, their faces, their hair. Sometimes they were touched, sometimes admired, sometimes mocked, always objectified. And beneath the fine fabrics, they were starving. Not for food, though often that too, but for privacy, for dignity, for the right to exist without being watched, because there is nothing more dehumanizing than being turned into decoration. You cannot cry when you are decoration. You cannot age when you are decoration. You cannot ask why. You must simply remain, pleasing. Rome pretended to love its displayed slaves, but it never asked them what they loved in return, because their role was not to feel, it was to reflect. And nothing reflected Rome's ego more sharply than a beautiful person who wasn't allowed to speak. Some slaves were entrusted with weapons, not for war, but for proximity. Bodyguards, doormen, armed escorts, silent watchers of Roman elites as they strolled through marble halls, dined at public feasts, bathed in luxury, trusted with steel, but never with freedom. Imagine it, being forced to defend the life of a man who owns yours. You stand behind him as he eats, as he laughs, as he complains about the servants, sometimes about you. And still, you watch, you wait, you listen for threats. You place your own body between him and harm, not because you love him, but because it is expected. These roles were carefully chosen. Masters selected men of strength, loyalty, composure, but even loyalty was not enough. Chains were still necessary. The trust, though deep, was always conditional, and betrayal was always a possibility. There were cases rare, but memorable, when the bodyguard turned, a knife drawn not against an enemy, but against the master himself, not out of madness, but calculation, desperation, or the realization, sudden and unbearable, that you are guarding a life that does not value your own. Rome feared this more than anything, the intimate rebellion, because proximity made the betrayal sharper. So they watched their guards as their guards watched them. They limited sleep. They demanded constant presence. They asked for smiles, for gratitude, for signs that the leash still held. Some guards became so trusted they were given minor commands over other slaves, over small parts of the estate. But even then, the line held. One wrong word, one missed signal, one suspicion, and you were back in the cellar, or worse. There is something particularly cruel about being forced to protect what destroys you. It blurs the edges, makes you forget where your self ends and your performance begins. Some grew to love their masters. Some convinced themselves they were chosen. Some whispered in the privacy of their minds that loyalty would lead to manumission. But hope, in this context, was a double-edged weapon. Because when it failed, the fall was deeper. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was quiet. A letter handed to a rival, a door left unbolted, a warning unspoken. And sometimes the guards simply vanished, melted into the streets of Rome, collar filed down, dagger sold for bread. The master awoke untouched, but changed, because he realized no chain is unbreakable, and no role, no matter how trusted, is truly safe. Not when the man who guards you also knows what your heartbeat sounds like in sleep. Among the Roman elite, some slaves knew everything. They were the secretus keepers of secrets. Personal attendants, scribes, letter carriers, lovers, stewards. They stood behind closed doors, not because they were trusted, but because they were always present, because they were invisible, because their silence was assumed. These slaves heard the confessions no one else was allowed to hear. They knew who owed whom money, who visited which bedroom, who cursed the emperor over wine. They knew which sons were disappointing, which daughters were inconvenient, which marriages were rotting under the weight of ambition. They knew everything, and they could never speak of it. Even among other slaves, their silence was necessary, because knowing too much was not a privilege. It was a noose. One wrong word overheard, repeated, misinterpreted, downed, their value became a threat. The master who once confided in them would become cold. The mistress who once wept into their lap would order a flogging. Rome's ruling class feared exposure more than death. They built their power on appearances, on control, and if a slave shattered that illusion of them by accident, they were removed. Quietly, permanently, so the confidants learned to bury what they heard, to nod without comment, to write letters they didn't agree with, to carry messages between lovers, between enemies, between conspirators without flinching. Some kept mental ledgers, every secret, every betrayal, not for revenge, but as a map, a way to stay alive, to know who could be manipulated, who was afraid, who might one day offer freedom, or at least safety. Others began to forget on purpose, to erase the faces behind the words, to reduce every secret to ink and duty, a thing to be filed and forgotten, because empathy was dangerous, because knowing and caring would only make the silence heavier. But even silence is a performance. You had to appear loyal, not just neutral. You had to flatter, to smile in the right places, to look surprised, concerned, entertained exactly when expected. And when your master told you his fears, you had to make him believe he was wise. And when your mistress whispered her longing, you had to make her feel pure. Your job was not just to keep secrets. It was to reflect the best version of the people who would never see the worst in you. And sometimes, that version became your own. You forgot your voice. You forgot your opinions. You became a mirror. And, like all mirrors, you feared the day someone would look too closely and find nothing but their own shadow staring back. In Rome, you were never irreplaceable. That was the final truth for the enslaved. No matter how skilled, how obedient, how loyal, no matter how many years you served, how many secrets you held, how much affection you pretended or even began to feel, there was always someone else who could take your place. And that knowledge followed you everywhere. A cook could be dismissed after one spoiled dish. A nursemaid replaced when the child grew restless. A steward sold when the estate changed hands. Even favored companions, those rare few who dined near the family, were kept close only as long as they were useful or amusing. Usefulness was a flickering thing. Youth faded, beauty dimmed, injuries happened, minds broke. Rome had no interest in healing what it could replace. The market was always full. Ships arrived daily with new bodies, war captives, debt slaves, children bred for servitude. A master displeased with a singer could walk to the forum and return with another by nightfall. No apology, no transition, just silence where your voice once was. Sometimes the replacements were placed in your old clothes. Sometimes they were given your name. You might watch your own role continue without like seeing a play performed after you've been fired from the cast. And what remained for you? If you were lucky, a quieter post, fewer duties, a place in the shadows. If you were not, you were sold, or punished, or simply left to fade. Rome did not waste time on the obsolete. Even the freed were not immune. A freedman who displeased his patron might lose his place, his contracts, his fragile standing in society. A freed woman could be cast out with a single whisper, too proud, too visible, too much like someone who thought she belonged. Because the truth is, the enslaved were never allowed to belong. They were permitted to exist, conditionally, temporarily, and always at the mercy of someone else's patience. To be replaced is not just to lose your work, it is to be erased. To realize that the version of yourself you performed so carefully, the mask you wore, the role you perfected, was never really seen, just used. And once it was no longer needed, it was forgotten. So they learned to let go early, not of hope, not entirely, but of being needed. They found value elsewhere. In friendship, in small kindnesses, in songs sung under breath, in knowing that, even if the world moved on without them, they had existed, they had loved, they had named the stars after people they missed, and no one could replace that, not really. Rome liked to believe it was generous. Its laws spoke of fairness. Its philosophers wrote about virtue. Its citizens praised themselves for treating slaves with dignity, for feeding them well, for offering occasional manumission as if it were divine favor. But woven through this vision of benevolence was an expectation. Gratitude, the master feeds you. Be grateful, he spares the rod today. Be grateful, he frees you after 20 years. Be grateful until your death. It didn't matter that he bought you like livestock. It didn't matter that he stripped you of name, of country, of kin. The narrative was always the same. The master is kind, and you, his slave, must thank him. This wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Gratitude was a shield the masters wore. He adores me, they'd say, pointing to a slave who had no choice. She owes me everything, they'd boast, of a woman whose body they had claimed without consent. To doubt this gratitude was to suggest something shameful about the entire system. So the slaves learned to perform it. A bowed head, a whispered thanks, a practiced smile, sometimes even sincere. Because sometimes, when you have nothing, no safety, no control, no future, a kind word feels like mercy. And sometimes it is. But that doesn't make the system just. It makes the kindness a trap. Because once you thank someone for not hurting you, you begin to forget they were allowed to hurt you to begin with. The most obedient slaves were praised as grateful. Their manumission plaques thanked their former owners for liberating them. The word gratis appeared often: grateful servant, grateful wife, grateful friend. Gratitude, always, even in freedom. even in death. We have inscriptions carved in stoneware. Freedmen thanked their masters for lives reclaimed. Sometimes they meant it. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was habit. Because gratitude was the only emotional currency they were allowed to spend. To feel anger, dangerous. To feel grief, inconvenient. To feel pride, insulting, but gratitude. Gratitude was safe. So they spoke it, even when their backs still bore scars. Even when their children had been sold. Even when their memories were full of cages and chains. Because Rome didn't just want slaves. It wanted slaves who were thankful to be owned. And if they weren't, it made sure no one ever heard them speak. Rome did not just demand obedience, it wanted affection. The perfect slave wasn't just efficient. He was cheerful, devoted, eager. The perfect slave didn't just serve without complaint. He loved his master, or appeared to. There are stories told with pride in Roman letters and biographies about loyal slaves who leapt between dagger and master, who nursed their owners through illness, who wept at their graves. Cicero wrote of his secretary, Tiro, as both brilliant and beloved. Pliny the Younger described his household slaves as faithful companions. Augustus claimed that some of his body servants knew his moods better than his family. They were not ashamed to love their slaves, but they were proud to be loved by them, because that love, to them, was proof that slavery worked, that it was humane, that ownership and affection could coexist, that kindness justified control. And so the myth of the good slave was born. She is happy with her lot. He is grateful for his place. They are loyal to the end. The problem is not that such affection never existed. It's that Rome refused to consider the cost. What does it take to become the good slave? You must silence your anger. You must forget your loss. You must smile when touched, nod when dismissed, thank someone for the roof they put over your cage. And if you do this well enough, for long enough, maybe they will call you loyal. But what they mean is, you are convenient. You do not trouble their conscience. Because real loyalty, the kind that grows between equals, requires choice. Slaves had no choice. They could be kind, they could care. But it was always under the gaze of the master, always under the weight of what could happen if they didn't. And Rome called that love. The myth endured in stone. Freedmen had tombs built beside their former masters, their epitaphs full of praise. To Marcus, who gave me everything. To Julia, my most gracious lady. The words are beautiful, but what lies behind them? Was it genuine, or was it insurance? A way to protect their children, to remain in favor, to be remembered. Perhaps all of the above, because love and survival are not always separate. Sometimes the person who imprisons you also saves your life. Sometimes the person who names you property also teaches you to read. And in that contradiction, a terrible bond forms. But it is not freedom. It is not peace. It is a wound shaped like gratitude. And Rome, so elegant, so articulate, never questioned the scar. Freedom in Rome came not as a right, but as a favor. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was framed as a reward, a gift bestowed by a generous master upon a deserving servant. It was the apex of the grateful slave narrative. Work well, obey, endure, and perhaps, one day, you'll be released. Perhaps the freedman became Libertus, the freedwoman Liberta. Their chains were gone, yes, but in many ways, their obligations remained. You did not simply walk away from a life of servitude. You were expected to thank your former master, publicly and permanently. You owed them loyalty, just as before. You might be summoned to serve on feast days, to walk in their funeral procession, to vote in their interests. You still called them Patronus or Patrona, your protector, your former owner, your lifelong shadow. Some manumissions came with contracts. Work for 5 more years. Remain celibate. Hand over a portion of your earnings. Raise your children under Roman values. Any failure might forfeit your status. This was freedom, Rome style, conditional, decorated, tethered, and still people longed for it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was the only exit Rome allowed. Some slaves bought their freedom, saving for years, accepting lower wages to accumulate the cost, counting every coin like a prayer. Some were freed for loyalty, others for beauty, for utility, for sentiment. A few were freed in wills, often too late to enjoy it. And for those who made it, who walked out with papers, who shaved their heads as a sign of rebirth, life remained a negotiation. You were never fully Roman. You could not run for office. You could not marry into old families. Your children might climb higher, but you were always someone who used to belong to someone else. And Rome never let you forget it. You might become rich. Some did. You might build a mausoleum. Some did. You might live in a house finer than your former master's. Rare, but possible. But the whispers followed you. That you used to scrub floors. That your Latin had an accent. That your name came with a stain. The manumitted lived in a limbo. Too good for the auction block. Never good enough for the Senate. And so they overcompensated. They named their patrons in stone. They celebrated Roman values louder than those born into them. They educated their children with ferocity. They distanced themselves from those still enslaved. And maybe, sometimes, they looked back with guilt, because they had made it out, and too many had not. But Rome didn't ask them to remember, only to be grateful, to nod, to smile, to wear their freedom like a gift, even when it still fit like a collar. You would think that freedom would bring a flood of words, a lifetime of silence, of obedience, of swallowed speech. Surely it would all come rushing out once the chains were off. Anger, memory, grief, name after name after name. But the truth, most freed slaves in Rome stayed quiet. Not because they had nothing to say, because they knew who was still listening. Freedom was not anonymity. It came with paperwork, with ceremony, with new expectations. You took on the name of your former master, Marcus, Tullius, Lucius, Cornelius, Publius, Aelius, a reminder carved into every syllable that you were free but never separate. You were still someone's story, still someone's proof of kindness. And if you broke that story by speaking honestly, by criticizing the system, by grieving too loudly, you risked everything. Not just your place, but your children's future. So the silence continued, not in every home, not in every heart, but often enough. Some wrote poems privately, some carved cryptic lines into tombs. Born to serve, I die my own, silent once, now still. These were not accusations, they were whispers, messages sent in the only safe medium, stone. Others vanished into the crowd, moved to distant towns, rebuilt lives under different names, spoke new languages, joined foreign cults. Reinvention was possible, but never without the weight of what had been lost. And some returned to the households that once owned them, as paid staff, as clients, as friends. Because when all your memories are tied to a place, even a cruel one, it's hard to let go. Because when your master dies, and no one else remembers the way he used to laugh, you do. Because trauma, twisted long enough, starts to feel like belonging, and Rome welcomed that silence. It praised the freedman who kept his head down. It rewarded the freedwoman who raised Roman daughters and never told them how she learned to hide bruises. It built a culture of erasure not by force, but by expectation, and the silence grew thicker than chains. There were no memoirs written by former Roman slaves, no manifestos, no revolts of the freed, only fragments, epitaphs, names and ledgers. Half-told stories, and always the lingering question, what would they have said if they had been allowed? Not to plead, not to accuse, just to speak. To tell us what it meant to survive a life no one wanted to remember. To describe, in their own words, what freedom really felt like, and whether it ever came. There's a reason we remember emperors, statues, coins, triumphs, names etched into arches and marble. They made sure of it. They wrote their stories into stone so deeply we can still read them 2,000 years later. But the enslaved, they wrote in silence. And yet, even silence leaves traces. A scratched name on the underside of a table, a hidden carving in the corner of a bathhouse wall, a whispered song passed down by those who could never say where it came from, only that it had always been there. These were not mistakes, they were acts of resistance. Because memory, for the enslaved, was not nostalgia, it was survival. A way to keep hold of something that could not be sold or silenced. A story, a face, a truth. Even when the world insisted otherwise. Even when Rome said, "Be grateful." Some slaves remembered their homes, the taste of barley cooked with herbs, the feel of sea wind before capture, the stories told around fires that no longer burned. They remembered in dreams, in habits, in smells, and some refused to forget their names, even when given new ones, even when punished, even when no one spoke them aloud anymore. They remembered. Some passed down lullabies in languages the masters couldn't understand. Others taught children words their owners thought were meaningless words, full of lineage, of mourning, of defiance. These weren't just cultural artifacts, they were quiet revolutions. Because when Rome demanded gratitude, it was asking for more than obedience. It was asking for amnesia. It wanted to be loved for what it permitted, not hated for what it took. It wanted its slaves to say thank you for the collar, for the food, for the chance to someday be less invisible. And some did, but others remembered. And even that, just that, was dangerous. Because if a memory could survive one person, it could survive two. And if two people remembered the same injustice, Rome could be challenged, not with swords, but with stories. So the enslaved carved what they could, on walls, on wood, on each other's hearts, not to be seen by Rome, but to outlive it. Because in the end, no empire can fully erase what it refuses to acknowledge, and a name whispered in defiance is stronger than a title carved in stone. Not every slave who ran was trying to be free. Some were just trying to breathe. Rome understood fugitives as broken property cogs out of alignment, goods gone missing. The term fugitivus carried weight, legal consequences, social stain, but it never carried context. Rome didn't ask why. It didn't want to know what made a mother leave her child behind in the dark. What made a man risk wolves in the forest over a whip in the villa? What kind of grief could outweigh fear? But people still ran. They ran for 1,000 reasons. Some ran because of a blow that landed wrong. Some because a promise of manumission was broken one too many times. Some because their child was sold and their heart left with them. Some didn't run at all, not until they found themselves walking faster than they ever had before, refusing to stop. Flight was not always planned. Sometimes it was spontaneous. A moment of quiet, an unlocked gate, a door left ajar after midnight. The whisper of possibility louder than chains. And each step after that was holy. Not safe, not painless, but sacred. Because every hour outside the master's gaze was a reclamation. I own this hour. I own this breath. I own this body, bruised though it is. The roads weren't kind. Forests could be worse. Cities, ironically, were both sanctuary and snared to many eyes, to many hands eager for a reward. A slave caught by a citizen was often returned with interest. Not just coins, but approval. Yet some found shelter in temples, among the poor, with others who had once fled, in places where Roman law grew, thin remote villages, mountain caves, bandit dens, the shadows of broken aqueducts, and some became myths. The slave who leaped from the cliffs and lived, the woman who poisoned her master and vanished, the boy who dressed as a girl, then a priest, then a ghost until no one remembered his name, only his escape. Were they real? Does it matter? Because for those still in chains, the story alone was a breath of air, a signal, proof that the world was wider than their cell, that escape, even if brief, even if brutal, was possible, not because it succeeded, but because it dared. And in a world where everything was stolen, your name, your child, your voice, that dare was a kind of prayer. Not to be free forever, but to be free once, to feel the weight fall away, to run not because someone told you to, but because your feet finally remembered they were yours. Once a slave ran, they became something else, not a person, a warning. Their name, if it had ever been known, was replaced with a description. Their story became a line on a wall, a voice in the marketplace, a prize on a poster. A short girl from Numidia, branded, scar on left cheek, known to lie. The hunt began with ink. Postings nailed to columns and doorways, distributed through slave dealers, passed by hand, each one a cold advertisement, a human being reduced to height, scars, and worth, 10 denarii for capture, 24 return in good health. Nothing for return in pieces, but no one asked. Then came the Venatorus slave catchers, men paid to follow trails, ask questions, dig into corners no one else bothered to look. They used dogs, spies, bribes. They scoured forests and sewers and swamps, turning over rocks, shaking down children. Sometimes they brought back the wrong person. No one cared. And if the runaway was caught, they weren't brought home. They were dragged, publicly, bound at the wrists, ankles, sometimes by the neck, paraded like an animal, not for justice, but for memory, so others would see, so others would fear. And the master would decide how visible the punishment should be, whether to whip them in the atrium or in the market square, whether to brand them again, this time deeper, whether to sell them to the mines, or make them crawl. There was no forgiveness. Escape was betrayal. Even if you had been faithful for years, even if you had been beaten every night, even if you had never once spoken your own name aloud. You had run, and that meant you believed in a world without them. Rome could not tolerate that. But some were never caught. Some vanished into the folds of the city, took new names, married other fugitives, passed as freedmen, or foreigners, or ghosts. They worked for coins, begged in dialects no one understood, joined temples where no one asked. They became shadows, and in doing so, they became free not in law, but in truth. The law would never forget them, but it would not find them either. And in their absence, they became dangerous, not to Rome's walls, but to its story. Because every fugitive said, without speaking, I was never what you said I was. And even if I die nameless, even if I am hunted until the end, you will never own this breath, this heartbeat, this choice to disappear. Rome, for all its discipline, had cracks. Between its marble columns and military roads, there were places where law faded, where the voices of gods competed with the voices of grief, where strangers passed without names, and where the enslaved sometimes found moments of sanctuary, not safety. That was too much to hope for. But sanctuary, the word itself meant sacred space, the inviolable, the untouchable, a temple's threshold, a shrine's corner, the altar where, even in Rome, the law sometimes paused. Some runaways reached these places. They crossed the city under moonlight. They climbed temple steps, barefoot, eyes wide with hunger and hope. And they wrapped their arms around the statues of gods, not because they believed in them, but because the alternative was worse. It was called Ius Post Lamini, the right of return under divine protection, a fragile hope. It did not always work. Some temples turned runaways away, priests too afraid of retribution. Others accepted them for a time, offering bread, water, a chance to plead. If the master came, they might negotiate, might agree to manumission, or might drag the slave away by the ankles while the gods watched, unmoved. But for a brief moment, the altar held them, a heartbeat of dignity. Some didn't aim for temples. They disappeared into the crowd. Rome was vast, dirty, loud, full of back alleys and kitchens and workshops where no one asked too many questions. A runaway might find work in the tannery district, or among foreign merchants, or sweeping ash in a bakery long before dawn. The trick was not to be seen, to speak little, to keep moving, to never grow too comfortable in one place. Some made allies, other fugitives, freedmen with secrets, women who knew what it meant to hide in plain sight. They traded information like currency, which guards looked the other way, which baths were safe, which homes would never let you leave again. Some fell in love, not with people, with moments, the smell of pine outside the city gates, a night without surveillance, a piece of bread that no one demanded be earned. It wasn't a life, but it wasn't captivity, and sometimes that was enough, until the day the law caught up, or the body gave out, or the fear became too heavy. Because sanctuary, in a world that doesn't recognize your humanity, is always temporary, and even freedom wears a mask. But for those brief, unclaimed days, the ones who ran were not slaves. They were seekers, pilgrims of their own worth. And Rome, for all its gods and glories, could never take that back. Sometimes sanctuary wasn't enough. Sometimes those who fled didn't want hiding. They wanted fire. The slave revolts of Rome were rare, but when they came, they were storms, not quiet defiance. Rebellion, the most famous, Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, trained to kill for sport, owned like an animal, admired like a champion, shackled like a threat. In 73, before Common Era, he broke free. Along with 70 others, they stormed a kitchen, took knives instead of swords, escaped the Ludista gladiator school at Capua, fled to Vesuvius, took the high ground. Rome laughed, then panicked, because Spartacus did not flee alone. He called others, and they came. From fields, from quarries, from kitchens and vineyards and iron collars. Soon, he led tens of thousands, not citizens, not soldiers, slaves. His army was a living wound on the empire. It moved like smoke, unpredictable, uncontainable. They defeated Roman legions, built encampments, shared spoils, buried their dead. For 2 years, they were not ghosts. They were a nation. They didn't just fight, they dreamed. Some wanted to escape to the Alps, others to burn Rome to the ground. All of them wanted something more than chains. And in that want, there was a revolution. Not of politics, of being. Rome could not tolerate that. The Senate sent Crassus, the richest man in the Republic. He built walls, not around cities, but around Spartacus himself. Trapped the army, starved them, waited. They fought anyway, and they fell. Spartacus died, his body never found. 6,000 of his followers were crucified, lining the Appian Way like a grotesque colonnade. A warning carved in bone, and yet they remembered, even after. Not in statues, not in temples, but in whispers. A song sung by a boy in a vineyard, eyes on the mountains. A woman who paused, just once, when asked to bow. A scar carried by someone who once believed they could be more than useful. The revolts didn't succeed, but they shattered the illusion that Rome was invincible, that slaves were content, that chains were eternal. Spartacus bled, yes, but so did the story, and every fugitive after him, every runaway with dust in their mouth and stars in their eyes, carried a piece of that wound, a reminder that even empires are afraid of those who no longer ask to be free, but take it. Not every escape ends with capture. Not every escape ends with freedom. Some end in a cave, cold and coughing, too sick to keep moving. Some end at the edge of a cliff, watching the world stretch wide, too far to cross. Some end in quiet surrender, feet too blistered, eyes too tired, hope too thin. But they ran anyway, because sometimes running wasn't about reaching anything. It was about refusing to stay. We like to imagine escape as a triumph, a gate breaking, a sunrise earned. But for most enslaved people in Rome, escape was a question without an answer. What do you do when the road goes nowhere? What do you become when no place will claim you? There are no graves for fugitives, no records, no reunions, only gaps in ledgers, a missing name. A space once filled by labor, now filled by speculation. Perhaps he drowned. Perhaps she fled east. Perhaps he was taken in. Perhaps she turned herself in. Perhaps there is a Latin phrase, absens carens, corpore absent, lacking the body. Rome didn't like loose ends. It preferred certainty. So when the escapes were never found, their absence became a ghost. Some masters waited for years. Others replaced them the next day. And the fugitive, they became myth. To those still in chains, their story lived on not as a lesson, but as a lullaby. Something to hold on to. A tale passed between shifts, beneath breath, behind eyes. Did you hear about him? He crossed the sea. They say she became a healer, lives in the hills. He joined a traveling troupe, pretends to be free and no one knows. Most of it wasn't true, but some of it was. And that sliver of truth was more powerful than any law, because escape, real or imagined, rewrote the rules. It reminded the enslaved that even Rome, with its armies and edicts and stones, could not seal every door. That breath could still be stolen back. That motion was still possible. That ownership was not destiny. And in those stolen hours, in those final footfalls, in that last look at the place you fled from you, became something the empire never meant you to be, unaccounted for, unwound. alive, even if only for a moment, even if only in memory. For the enslaved, even death was not their own. In Rome, burial was a privilege, a ceremony, a ritual of remembrance. But for most slaves, death came quietly, and disposal came quicker. There were no mausoleums waiting, no named tombs in marble, no poems etched in stone, just a body and a problem. If you were lucky, you died in a household that valued appearances. You might be placed in a simple grave, marked only by initials. Sometimes your fellow slaves would gather, if allowed, whispering a prayer learned from a homeland no one else remembered. But more often you were discarded, thrown into mass pits outside the city. Puticuli they were called. Giant communal trenches for the poor, the unknown, the inconvenient. No records, no rights, no last words. The air around these pits buzzed with flies. Dogs circled, ash-covered skin. The city kept building, kept feasting, kept praising its gods. No one paused for the servant who died cleaning the atrium floor. No one mourned the girl who never spoke her true name. In Roman religion, burial mattered. To be unburied meant unrest. To be unremembered meant a kind of second death. No soul, no peace, no after. And yet, for the enslaved, this was the expected end. So their friends found ways to fight it. They pooled coins, bought plots in shared cemeteries, formed collegiate burial clubs, groups of slaves and freedmen who saved for one another, who said, quietly but insistently, "We will not let each other vanish." Sometimes inscriptions appear, small, crude, lovingly chiseled, to Amara, who sang at dusk, to Felix, who told stories, to Onesimus, my friend, my brother, not grand but real, and in that reality, a defiance. Because Rome thought slaves should die the way they lived usefully, quietly, without resistance. But they resisted anyway, by naming each other, by mourning each other, by saying, "You were here." Even when the law said they weren't, even when history tried to forget, their deaths weren't clean, but their memory that lingered, not in statues, but in grief, in the ache of absence, in the hands of those who lit candles in secret, because even the unburied can be remembered, even the unfree can be mourned, and mourning, in a world that denies your humanity, is an act of reclamation. Rome was a city of gods, official ones, with temples and feast days. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, the usual suspects, surrounded by marble and incense and the blood of sacrifice. But the enslaved often turned elsewhere, not because they rejected the gods of Rome, but because those gods didn't see them. Jupiter didn't know what it meant to scrub floors until your hands bled. Mars didn't care about a child taken in the night. Venus had never been touched without consent, so the enslaved whispered to other deities, older ones, foreign ones, household spirits, river ghosts, the gods of mothers and grandmothers, gods whose names had no Latin translation, who came from Nubia, from Syria, from Gaul and Illyria, and lands the Senate barely knew how to pronounce. Some worshipped Isis, the Egyptian mother, who promised justice after death. Others whispered to Dionysus, not the Roman version, all wine and theatre, but the older, darker Dionysus, who knew what it meant to be torn apart and come back changed. There was Mithras, worshipped in shadows. There were Lares and Pinetes, gods of the hearth, who watched over households including those enslaved within them. And there were gods with no statues, just stories. Just prayers carved into the inside of a collar. Just a name whispered before bed. Just a rhythm hummed during labor. These gods were not powerful in the Roman sense, but they listened. They saw what the magistrates did not. They offered something Rome couldn't: hope without permission. Because in official religion, a slave could not initiate rites, could not be a priest, could not offer sacrifice on behalf of the state. But in the hidden corners of belief, they could be seen. And when death came, when the body failed and the name was erased and the soul hovered, these gods promised more. Not punishment, not reward, recognition. You were here, you mattered. You were not just what they called you. And in that promise, something sacred grew. A theology of the forgotten, not written in scrolls, but in scars, in lullabies, in the way one slave looked at another and said, "We are more than this." Rome never worshipped those gods, but it feared them. Because in the end, a person who believes they will be remembered is harder to break. Some slaves escaped the grave by escaping slavery. Manumission granted life of a sort, a new name, a few rights, a future, and with it came the hope of legacy. Freedmen built tombs, not grand ones, not imperial, but solid. They placed them along roadsides, where travelers might read their names, their trades, the name of the patron who'd once owned them. They filled the stone with stories. I was a baker. I raised 3 children. I served my master with loyalty. I was freed in my 47th year. Sometimes there was pride, sometimes poetry, often silence where the pain should be. But behind every inscription lay a shadow, the memory of being owned. Freedom didn't erase it. If anything, it sharpened it. Because now they had something to compare it to. The open air, the right to refuse, the small, private dignity of going to sleep without waiting for permission. And yet they were still marked by their names. Tyro, Felix, Chrysogonus names that signaled servitude, by the title Libertus, always tied to someone else's legacy, by the stories they couldn't tell their children. Some buried that past, others built it into stone. There are tombs where a freedman honors the master who freed him, carving his gratitude as if still on leash. But there are others where a freed woman names her enslaved parents, where a former cook lists not her service, but her favorite dish, where a man writes, "I was born in chains, I die a man." Small rebellions, echoes, and sometimes guilt. Survivor's guilt, because freedom was rare, and those who earned it knew they had left others behind. Friends, lovers, children, faces that haunted dreams, voices that lingered in corners. Some tried to buy their loved ones' freedom, some succeeded, some were refused. And the ones who couldn't forget, they kept the memory alive in other ways. A statue carved in a familiar posture, a slave girl buried alongside her freed mistress, a line in a will that reads, "Let her be buried near me, for she was more sister than servant." These were not grand gestures, but they mattered, because Rome told them to forget, to assimilate, to be Roman, to be grateful. And still, they remembered, not just the pain, but the people, and in doing so, they refused the neat ending. They let the afterlife be messy, human, unfinished, because the story of Roman slavery didn't end with manumission. It ended with memory, and memory, like mourning, is a kind of resistance. There were millions. Over the centuries, Rome enslaved more human beings than it could ever name. Gauls taken in battle, Greeks taken in debt, Africans taken in chains, infants born into ownership, elders who died before their time, people erased before they could be recorded. We speak of them now in fragments, not because they were small, but because history made them so. There are records, ledgers, inventories of livestock, silver, wheat and humans. 3 girls, trained in weaving. 1 elderly man, limps. Boy, mute. 11, obedient. They appear like footnotes, line items, an afterthought in Empire's math. No names, just users. And yet each one was a life. Each one had a mother, even if she was lost. Each one had a fear that visited at night. Each one had a moment when they laughed, and no one punished them. These are the stories we cannot fully tell, not because they didn't exist, but because they were denied the tools of legacy. No scrolls, no portraits, no tombs. Just shadows on the wall of a world that celebrated conquest but silenced consequence. Sometimes we find a bone, a tooth, a collar with rusted metal where skin once pulsed. Sometimes we find graffiti, "I miss you," scratched on a wall behind a bathhouse. A joke written in vulgar Latin, too crude for polite society. A prayer for someone whose name is spelled wrong because the carver never learned to write. And sometimes nothing, just absence. And yet we remember them, not in detail, but in grief, because grief, unlike history, doesn't need footnotes. It only needs love, a love wide enough to reach back and say, "I see you. I believe you were more than what they made of you. I carry your story, even if I don't know your name." And in that simple act, a whisper against centuries of silence, they live again. Not in triumph, not in vengeance, but in acknowledgement. And sometimes, that is the most sacred resurrection of all. Rome is long gone. Its temples crumble, its statues weather. Its language lives only in fragments and footnotes. The Senate has vanished. The emperors lie still beneath their mausoleums. But the people it enslaved, their story hasn't ended. Because every empire leaves a shadow. And in that shadow are echoes of the whip, of the chain, of the voice that said yes, master, even when it wanted to scream. We are their descendants not by blood, perhaps, but by legacy. We live in cities built on systems they never chose. We inherit languages they were never allowed to speak freely. We walk through museums that tell the story of Rome without naming the hands that built it. And every time we say civilization, we must ask who paid for that word, not in coins, in breath, in labor, in stolen time. There is a quiet reckoning in that question. A chance to look backward, not to assign guilt, but to offer witness. To say, even now, even this far away, I see the cost. I hear what was taken. I mourn who was lost. History is not just names and dates. It is grief. It is silence, broken. It is the gentle insistence that the forgotten deserve more than forgetting. We may never know their full names. We may never find their graves. But we can remember this. They were here. They lived. And they mattered. Not because they served Rome, but because they survived it. Because in the quiet of their afterlife, they are still with us. In the stories we tell, in the questions we ask, and in the space we make for sorrow that is not ours, but which we choose to carry anyway. Because to carry that sorrow is to honor their humanity. And to honor their humanity is finally to reclaim our own. This is the part of the story where we usually end with hope. A lesson, a resolution, a brighter future. But for the Roman slave, there was no neat ending, no triumph arc, no closing credits. And maybe that's why we must linger here a little longer. Because the final truth of slavery in Rome isn't just about cruelty. It isn't just about endurance. It's about what remained, even when everything else was taken. And what remained was this, the human self, however buried, however beaten, however reshaped into someone else's tool. There is a part of us quiet, stubborn, unsellable, that survives. It survives through lullabies hummed under breath, through eyes that meet in silence across a room, through laughter stolen between shifts, through remembering someone's name, even after the world has forgotten it. It survives in resistance, yes, but also in love. The enslaved were not just victims of pain. They were participants in life. They found joy where they could, fell in love where it was dangerous, raised children when they were allowed, hid food, told jokes, saved each other from despair when they could. They imagined futures, they told stories, they mourned. And in doing so, they proved the thing Rome tried to deny, that ownership is a lie. You can chain a body, you can silence a voice, you can rename a soul, but you cannot truly own another human being, because no matter how long the leash, no matter how deep the scar, there is always a piece left untouched, a word unsaid, a breath unbent, a dream passed down in darkness. This is the last word Rome could never write, the part it feared most, the part it tried over and over to erase and failed, because it lives still, in history, in grief, in you. There are few names we can trace. Tyro, Cicero's scribe, Narcissus, who served an emperor, Onesimus, remembered in scripture, Epictetus, the philosopher who began in chains and ended in thought. They are exceptions, the known, the visible, but most names are lost, carried away by time, burned in house fires, buried without markers, scrubbed from ledgers when they ceased to be profitable, forgotten by generations, taught only to remember their masters. So we say their names instead. The ones we can: Tyro, Narcissus, Onesimus, Epictetus. We say them not because they were perfect, but because they reached us, because their voices somehow still echo. And when we say their names, we speak for the rest. For the girl who died unnamed, hands stained with dye, singing in a language no one else knew. For the man who held his lover's hand as they were sold in opposite directions. For the woman who never stopped humming the lullaby her mother once whispered beneath a foreign moon. They deserve that, not monuments, not vengeance, just remembrance, a word carried gently, a pause before moving on. And when we say their names, we say something else too, that they mattered, that their pain was not in vain, that their silence was never empty, and that their stories, even if incomplete, are still worth telling. Because history has gaps, and grief knows how to fill them, with reverence, with tenderness, with the kind of listening that doesn't demand answers, only presence, only breath, only the quiet insistence that someone else's suffering is not yours to fix, but yours to hold. And sometimes holding it is enough. Even in chains, people dream. That is the secret Rome never understood. You can whip a man until his back splits open. You can sell a child from her mother's arms. You can crush bone, starve flesh, rename and dehumanize, but you cannot stop the mind from wandering, and wander it did, in the quiet between commands, in the moments before sleep, when the ache fades just long enough for thought, in songs, in stories, in the memory of water that wasn't rationed, of sun that didn't mean labor, of voices raised not in fear, but in joy. Enslaved people dreamed of being whole, of being free, not just legally freedom as a line in a will, but truly free to sit when tired, to love who they loved, to die without apology. Some dreamed of returning home, even if they didn't remember what home looked like anymore. Others invented new homes, places where no one was owned, where dignity was not conditional, where laughter didn't echo off marble floors guarded by punishment. And yes, some dreams were bitter, of revenge, of fire, of names remembered not with reverence, but with rage. Rome feared those dreams. That's why it built walls not just around cities, but around hearts, taught submission as natural, preached that slavery was destiny, that to dream otherwise was foolish, dangerous, but they dreamed anyway. And in doing so, they preserved a piece of themselves, untouched by empire. That dreaming was an inheritance, and perhaps it is still with us. In the questions we ask now, in the way we seek out these stories, even when they hurt, in the part of us that hears about a child in chains 2,000 years ago, and still feels something crack. That is the dream, alive still. That a better world is not only possible but necessary, not because history demands it, but because humanity does. And that's the last truth Rome could never conquer. Not with roads, not with swords, not even with time. It's late now, too late for most things. Too late for apologies, too late for amends, too late to bring anyone back, but maybe not too late to remember. History, after all, is not a courtroom, it's a bedroom. A quiet place where stories whisper more than they shout, where the past lays down beside you not to lecture, but to stay. Tonight, that past is heavy, the weight of 1,000,000 unnamed lives, the echo of footsteps on stone floors, the breath caught in throats before commands, the rustle of chains beneath wool, the prayers whispered in dialects no one wrote down. But there is comfort too, not because the pain is over, but because you're listening, because tonight someone remembered what Rome tried to forget, and in remembering made space for something softer, not justice, but presence, not closure, but connection. You didn't ask for this story, not really. It found you in the dark. It sat at the edge of your bed. It asked you not to solve, or fix, or argue, just to hear, just to be still. And now you have. That matters, because somewhere, somewhen, someone else dreamed of being known, not as property, not as service, not even as hero, just as real. And maybe this quiet hour answers that dream. You heard them, you stayed. You let their stories settle into the night. That's all they ever wanted, and it is, perhaps, all that history asks. There is no great monument to the Roman slave, no soaring column, no solemn museum wing, no national day of mourning, but maybe there is this, a whisper carried across time, a breath taken not in bondage, but in memory, a story not erased, not rewritten, but allowed to rest, allowed to exist, allowed to hurt. You've made it to the end, and in doing so, you've offered something rare. You've borne witness, not just to history, but to humanity, to the people Rome tried to use up, to the ones who ran, who stayed, who loved, who broke, who endured, to those who were never meant to be remembered. And yet here they are, and here you are, in the quiet of night, a little more tired, a little more full, a little less alone. That matters. Because when we remember those who were silenced, we reclaim something for ourselves, not power, but tenderness, not triumph, but truth. Thank you for carrying this story. Sleep well if you can. And if you can't, know that you're not alone in the dark. You are seen, you are here, you are free. Thank you for staying with me tonight. If this story sat with you, if it made you feel something, thank you for letting it in. You didn't have to watch, you didn't have to stay, but you did. and that means more than you know. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, slow, human, and quietly haunting, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just if it feels right. And if you're still awake, feel free to leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, or what time it is, or maybe just a word that's been sitting on your chest lately. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, I hope you find a little peace tonight. Good night.